So welcome everyone to our February edition of the Diabetes Action Canada Research Spotlight featuring our Sex and Gender Research Program. My name is Tracy McQuire and I'll be moderating today's session. Before we begin, I have a couple of notes I want to share with each of you. The translation information to access simultaneous French translation is available in the chat for everyone, and an email went out yesterday that had the call-in information and the slides in both English and French for people to refer to throughout today's presentation. Please use the question and answer function versus the chat function to ask any questions during today's webinar. We will be collecting questions throughout the webinar, and we will address them at the end when we have 15 minutes dedicated for question and answer. I will now introduce our speakers for today. Today we have Dr. Zoe Jones and Jennifer Ackerman joining us, and I'd like to take a brief moment to introduce Zoe. Zoe is the project lead and research assistant for Women's College Hospital. She received her PhD at Carleton University in sociology and her master's in criminology at Laurier. We also have Jennifer Ackerman. Jennifer is the research coordinator for the Women's Exchange and the Diabetes Action Canada Sex and Gender Enabling Program. She is a Bachelor of Arts and Science from McMaster University and a Master's in Public Health in Social and Behavioral Health Sciences from the University of Toronto. So I will now pass the floor over to Zoe and Jennifer to start today's webinar.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for coming to our DAC webinar, Research Spotlight on Sex and Gender. We're really excited to share our research with you. So as our wonderful host said, my name is Zoe Jones and my colleague here is Jennifer Ackerman. We're from the Women's College Research Institute. So today we'll be talking about a concept called SGBA+, Sex and Gender-Based Analysis Plus, as well as our qualitative research project, exploring the lived experiences of diabetes through an intersectional SGBA+ lens.
Great, thanks Zoe and Tracy. So I just want to echo what's been said. Thank you all so much for joining us this morning. We're grateful for your attention and interest, and we'll also be asking for your participation as well a little bit later on in the webinar. So before we begin, I'll just give a brief background on Diabetes Action Canada Sex and Gender Research Enabling Group, which is based out of Women's College Research Institute in Toronto, as Zoe said. So for the last 6 years, Women's College Research Institute has collaborated with Diabetes Action Canada on advancing the integration of a sex and gender lens in DAC research projects and all its related activities. Through individualized consultations, educational presentations, online resources, and facilitated workshops, DAC investigators were provided support on why and how sex and gender should be included in different study designs. And this will help ensure that all of DAC strategies and interventions for the prevention and treatment of diabetes-related complications are sensitive to a sex and gender considerations, and thereby improving patient care, scientific output, and avoiding data waste. And so the current members of our team are on this slide, of which Zoe and I are proudly a part of. And today I will kick off the webinar by defining, what is sex and gender, why these concepts are important in diabetes research, and why it's important to move beyond sex and gender and adopt what's called an intersectional sex and gender-based analysis plus lens, or SGBA plus for short, in health research. And then I'll hand it over to Zoe, who will present the research design for our new qualitative study, which is called Exploring the Lived Experiences of Diabetes through an Intersectional SGBA plus lens. Great, okay, so let's get started. Perfect, thanks for changing the slide, Zoe. So we live in a world that was designed by and for men, because for the most part, we have not collected data on women. Historically, clinical trials excluded women from participating, and this was the norm right up until the 1990s. And as a result, the female perspective is often missing from policies, programs, medical treatment guidelines, and even everyday items are based on male data. And the white 40-year-old male that weighs approximately 170 pounds became the average human norm. So confronted by a world that doesn't account for their unique needs, women must often adapt to uncomfortable circumstances, like working in office buildings with temperatures based on the male metabolism, which is depicted by the picture on the left, to dangerous situations, such as riding in vehicles that are 71% less safe for women and men because they were safety tested with dummies fitting the measurements of an average male's size and weight. And so ultimately there is a gender data gap. But before we go any further, let's define what we mean by sex and gender. So sex refers to the biological attributes associated with physical and physiological features, such as chromosomes, gene expression, hormone levels and function, and reproductive sexual anatomy. Sex has traditionally been understood as dimorphic, so one is either male or female. However, we are increasingly aware that there are variations in XX and XY chromosome expression, and approximately 1% of individuals are born intersex, which is to say that they can express both male and female sex features. Gender refers to the socially constructed and accepted roles, behaviors, expressions, and identities of girls, women, boys, men, and gender diverse persons. Gender influences how people perceive themselves and each other, how they act and interact, and also the distribution of power and resources in society. Gender is usually conceptualized as a binary, girl, woman, and boy, man, but there's considerable diversity in how individuals understand, experience, and express gender. One important term to understand is gender identity, which is one's most innermost concept of self, which may be the same as or different from the sex assigned at birth. So cisgender, for example, describes a person whose sense of personal identity and gender corresponds with their birth sex. So for example, a person born female who identifies as a girl or a woman. Transgender defines a person whose gender identity differs from the sex the person had or was identified as having from birth. Go to the next slide. Great. So the sex and gender data gap extends to medicine and health research. In fact, contemporary research shows that biological and social differences between women and men contribute to differences in health. And as you can see from this slide, sex and gender have been shown to influence our risk of developing certain illnesses, our reactions to medical treatment, and how often we seek care. So for example, if we start with the animated brain in the top left-hand corner, that's denoting dementia. And research has shown that there are sex differences in the risk of developing dementia, where dementia affects more females than males and increases with age. In terms of gender differences associated with dementia, research has shown differences in terms of isolation, where 68% of seniors living alone are women. For the second example, we can look at heart attack. So in terms of sex differences with heart attack symptoms, males and females actually differ in how they present with heart attack symptoms. So females have pain in the neck, back, or jaw, and males have the more traditional pain in chest and discomfort. And we've also seen gender differences in terms of diagnoses. So women are actually 7 times more susceptible to being incorrectly diagnosed during a heart attack and sent home from the emergency department than men. And as a last example, with the pill bottle is really referring to medication management. So sex differences have been shown between males and females in how they metabolize drugs, where women or females can metabolize certain drugs differently or slower than men. And there's also been gender differences in terms of how women and men seek treatment. So women, for example, women are more likely to ask for treatment for misuse of central nervous system depressors than men. And so the more we understand the influence of sex and gender on health, the more we will be able to improve the health and well-being of all.
So today we have an activity for you to see if you think something is sex or gender. So we have 4 slides with questions, and it's up to you to guess or tell us if you think it's sex or gender. So to join the quiz, you can go to slido.com and type in 65357, or use your cell phone camera to look at the QR code in the corner. So we'll see you as you join in the box, and we'll give that a couple minutes.
great. Here come some people.
Yeah. We're still in there too, Jen. So maybe we'll get started.
Sure, sounds good.
Yeah. So the first question, women visit their care provider more frequently than men for both physical and mental health concerns. Is this sex or gender?
So we'll give you about 20 seconds to answer.
That's great, that's 8, that's our people. Gender and both.
Interesting. Yeah, so this we would say is primarily a gender difference related to health-seeking behavior. So women are more likely to visit their primary care providers to discuss health issues. Men have typically been underrepresented in primary care research, and we're not totally sure why this is, but it may be stigma associated around mental health or traditional gender roles for men to tough it out when they're not feeling well. Great job.
Thanks, Jen. The next question is, men have heart attacks at a younger age than women. Is this sex, gender, or both? Ooh.
Oh, interesting. Okay, that's really interesting that we see this split because it could be both. It could be sex and gender. So in terms of sex-specific differences, men have heart attacks at a younger age than women do, largely because premenopausal women benefit from the hormonal protection of estrogens. But it could also be related to gender, gender differences in how men and women engage in risky behaviors, like smoking or maintaining a poorly balanced diet. So it could be both. So that's really interesting. Great job, guys.
The third question, young women with type 1 diabetes may restrict their insulin intake to achieve weight control or weight loss. Is this sex or gender?
Interesting. Yes. So this would be a gender behavior difference associated with the pressures that young women often experience in relation to body image and the pursuit of an excessively thin body ideal. And often young women can use body weight and shape to determine self-worth. So those sort of behaviors would be considered a gender difference.
And the last one, women are prescribed lower doses of certain drugs than men. Is this sex or gender?
Great. Yeah, so we had a little bit of a preview of this question in the example, but this would be a sex difference because males and females can respond and metabolize drugs differently. So to take an example, so we can look at the popular sleep aid Ambien. And in 2013, the Food and Drug Administration claimed that women should receive a lower dose of Ambien than men. And they actually cut the dose in half because women clear the drug from their system more slowly than men. And were actually more impaired by it at the 8-hour mark. So when women were waking up and starting their day. And in fact, they were finding that women who took the original dose of Ambien were getting in more car accidents. So it's a really important sex difference to understand, but that's great. Okay, well, thanks so much for your participation. Mel, number one. That's great. Perfect. Okay, great. So consideration of gender and sex in health research can help improve the rigor, reproducibility, and applicability of health research. And this includes diabetes research. So let's look at the data. So in terms of sex differences associated with diabetes, we can look at data from the Government of Canada. This is the latest data from 2017, I believe. And approximately 3 million Canadians have been diagnosed with diabetes. And the prevalence of diabetes diagnoses generally increases with age and is higher among males than females. Sex differences have also been observed in risk factors associated with type 2 diabetes. So type 2 diabetes is more frequently diagnosed at a younger age and lower BMI among males. However, obesity, which is the most important risk factor for type 2, is often higher among females. When we consider gender differences associated with diabetes, gender differences have been found in research about social context. So adolescent girls have reported struggling with stigma and fitting in and self-image at school. Men are less likely to disclose their diabetes to people at work and in their social lives. And women's roles in the family, so for example, as a wife or grandmother, may interfere with diabetes self-management. But what I've just presented were the sex and gender considerations of diabetes of the general population. But the data changes when we look at the impact of the intersection of sex and gender and other identity factors on diabetes for particular groups. So first, let's consider sex differences. So studies have shown that generally type 2 diabetes is more prevalent in males than females. However, we see this story change when we consider the intersection of sex with age. For example, studies have shown that approximately 2/3 of children and adolescents diagnosed with type 2 diabetes are female. But when we examine the intersection of sex with age and race, we see something different again. Studies on sex differences in the prevalence of type 2 among Asian youth reported a higher prevalence in boys compared with girls. So this example highlights the need to consider the concurrent effects of sex, age, and race when considering the prevalence of diabetes, but it doesn't yet take into consideration other lifestyle and environmental factors that are often involved in type 2 diabetes. Great, so now let's look at a gender example. So research has shown differences among men and women related to their type 2 diabetes self-care. Men engage in more physical activity than women, but women have to maintain a balanced diet and monitor their blood glucose more frequently than men. However, women report feeling lower levels of diabetes-related self-efficacy than men. And that is to say that they have less confidence in their ability to manage their disease. When we examine gender, race, and diabetes self-care, we see that Black women report poor levels of diabetes self-care and lower self-efficacy than white women and both white and Black men. So without an intersectional lens, these distinctions are lost and individuals may receive inappropriate treatment, perpetuating rather than eliminating health inequities. But the data alone doesn't tell the whole story. When we see differences in data disaggregated by social stratifiers like gender and race, these differences should act as information triggers that then spark further investigation to understand why there are differences between and within certain groups of men, women, and people of different races. Contextualization of differences observed in the data is very critical, but it's also very complex. And we can begin to try to understand why we're seeing these differences by first considering what makes people sick. So the Government of Canada refers to social determinants of health as, quote, a specific group of social and economic factors within the broader determinants of health. These relate to an individual's place in society, such as income, education, or employment. Experiences of discrimination or historical trauma are also important social determinants of health for certain groups, such as Indigenous peoples. So the research is clear that these social and economic factors influence health not only in certain cases or for some people, but in every case and for everyone. These factors are continuously contributing to one's health and well-being. And so from this figure on the slide by the Canadian Medical Association, it's easy to see that health is primarily determined not by biology or even the care and treatment received through the health system, but instead health is most influenced by the social environments in which people live. Their income, race, gender, access to food, education, and networks of support. In other words, the social determinants of health. So while significant strides have been made in considering sex differences in health research, less attention has been paid to the diversity of identities within populations of women and men. So approaching women and men or gender diverse people as a homogeneous group erases other important salient identities. And an intersectional sex and gender lens, or SGBA plus, is key to implementing rigorous research with results that can be applied to tailoring treatments and addressing inequities. And this is why research must go beyond simply looking at sex and gender by adopting an SGBA plus lens. So a sex and gender-based analysis plus lens, or SGBA plus, in research involves the systematic evaluation of differences associated with sex and gender and their intersection with other identity factors, such as age, race, socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, migration status, geography, etc. And there are some others on this very colorful slide from the CIHR. And how these identity factors influence an individual's health and experiences in the healthcare system. So for example, consider an Indigenous, cisgender, disabled woman living in poverty. She's not separately a woman, a person with a disability, an Indigenous person, a person living in poverty. She lives at the intersection of all of those identities. And research that integrates an intersectional lens is inclusive and equitable. SGBA plus also involves the consideration of structures of power and how systems of privilege and oppression shape a person's lived experience. For example, it's important to distinguish that gender, race, and Indigenous identity are not determinants of health in themselves, but rather it's the effects of the structural systems of sexism, racism, and colonialism that assign value and grant opportunities and privilege, which then influence health. And this way of thinking about human beings are shaped by the social categories that comprise identity is a theoretical concept that's called intersectionality. The term intersectionality was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, a critical race theorist, in her 1989 paper that was titled Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex. But the fundamental concepts of intersectionality were born out of Black feminist thinkers as early as 1827 with Sojourner Truth's Ain't I a Woman speech, and they were strengthened in the mid-1900s with activists such as Audre Lorde, Patricia Hill Collins, Angela Davis, Bell Hooks, and members of the Combahee River Collective. And in the 1970s and 1980s, these scholars were speaking and writing about feeling excluded from both the mainstream women's movements and mainstream anti-racism movements. They argued that being Black and a woman was a unique position that was not considered in the discourse of either of these movements. So an intersectional analysis is comprised of two essential premises. First, that the experiences of an individual are the result of the intersection and interaction of their multiple identities and unique circumstances. For example, their race, ethnicity, Indigenous status, gender, geography, etc. And further, that these interactions are experienced within the context of systems and structures of power. So that could be laws, policies, state governments, the media, even religious institutions. And it's through these combined processes that forms of privilege and oppression that are shaped by colonialism, imperialism, racism, homophobia, ableism, and the patriarchy developed and are perpetuated. So on the left-hand side of the slide is a picture of the Canadian Research Institute for the Advancement of Women, or CREA for short, and their intersectionality wheel. So the innermost circle represents an individual's unique circumstances. The second circle, particular aspects of identity. And the third circle describes the various forms of discrimination that impact identity. Finally, the outermost circle shows the social forces and structures that impact our lives. So applying an intersectionality lens means acknowledging multiple identities while also considering how these interact in relation to power, privilege, oppression, and marginalization, and in doing so, shape the experience of health or illness. Great, so we have a short video about intersectionality to learn more.
What is intersectionality? Intersectionality is a way of understanding social relations by examining intersecting forms of discrimination. This means acknowledging that social systems are complicated and that many forms of oppression, like racism, sexism, and ageism, might be present and active at the same time in a person's life. Everyday approaches to building equality tend to focus on one type of discrimination, for instance, sexism, and then work to address only that specific concern. But while the career of a young, white, and able-bodied woman might improve with gender equality protections, an older, Black, disabled lesbian may continue to be hampered by racism, ageism, ableism, and homophobia in the workplace. Intersectionality is about understanding and addressing all potential roadblocks to an individual or group's well-being. But it's not as simple as just adding up oppressions and addressing each one individually. Racism, sexism, and ableism exist on their own, but when combined, they compound and transform the experience of oppression. Intersectionality acknowledges that unique oppressions exist, but is also dedicated to understanding how they change in combination. The roots of intersectionality lie within the Black feminist movement, with legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw originating the term. Crenshaw felt that anti-racist and feminist movements were both overlooking the unique challenges faced by Black women. She stated that legislation about race is framed to protect Black men, and legislation about sexism is understood to protect white women. So simply combining racism and sexism together does not therefore protect Black women. Intersectional theory is now applied across a range of social divisions and also to understandings of domination, such as those associated with whiteness, masculinity, and heterosexuality. Intersectionality is not only about multiple identities, and it's not a simple answer to solving problems around equality and diversity. It is, however, an essential framework as we truly engage with issues around privilege and power and work to bring them into the open. Intersectionality means listening to others, examining our own privileges, and asking questions about who may be excluded or adversely affected by our work. As importantly, it means taking measurable action to invite, include, and center the voices and work of marginalized individuals.
Great. Perfect, thanks, Zoe. So the best practices for operationalizing an intersectional SGBA plus lens in health research are still evolving. The team at Women's College Hospital, led by Dr. Paula Rochon and Dr. Robin Mason, have developed metrics for assessing sex and gender integration in health research proposals involving human participants. Moreover, the Sex and Gender Research Enabling Group, we're also developing best practices for integrating sex and gender considerations into every step of the research process. So from research conception all the way to knowledge translation. Thanks, and I'll hand it over to Zoe.
So with that wonderful explanation of SGBA plus and intersectionality, I would like to now introduce our research project, exploring the experience of living with diabetes through an intersectional SGBA plus lens. In this project, we're applying the concepts of SGBA plus, the sex and gender based analysis plus, and intersectionality that Jennifer explained to a qualitative research project about diabetes. In addition to ensuring that SGBA Plus is integrated into the research process, as one of DAC's research enabling groups, we're also committed to collaborating with our patient partners through some of the principles of patient-oriented research. So the people on our research team on this slide are all from the Sex and Gender Research Enabling Group. From WCRI, we have Robin Mason, Jennifer Ackerman, my co-presenter, and myself, Zoe Jones. We also have 3 patient partners joining us on this project: Virtue Bajourney, Sasha Delorme, and Andre Gaudreau. We're lucky to have Andre joining us today. We have a video from him actually, but he's also in the participant pool in case he wants to answer anything later. So this is a message that we have from Andre about why he thinks it is important to adopt an SGBA Plus lens in diabetes research.
Hi everybody, I am Andre Gaudreau, patient partner. I have been part of sex and gender research from the start. I find it important that research looks at this dimension because you must take into consideration the language, the difference between the sexes and LGBT people and different ethnies.
Thank you for that video, Andre. So our research is also informed by DAC's patient engagement resource material about working with patient partners. We wanted to highlight today some of the great work that 2 of our DAC patient partners, Virtue and Sasha, have been involved in creating, the 10 do's and don'ts for patient-oriented research. This project was not associated with us, with the DAC Sex and Gender Research Enabling Group, but we've adopted these guidelines into our research practices. So here are the first 3. So 1, treat patient partners as equal. Patient partners are experts in their own right. The do for this item is recognize that patient partners' lived experience will provide valuable insight that a researcher or medical professional may not have. Number 2, patient partners do not want to be included in a tokenistic manner. They want to be a true part of the project. They say do invite patient partners to engage in all parts of the project and be sure to ask for their input. An example they gave is a roundtable method ensures that everyone has an opportunity to speak. Don't, though, invite patient partners onto the project because you have to, and then ignore the potential for their valuable contribution. And number 3 is clearly set out expectations from the beginning of the project so that expectations are managed for both patient partners and researchers. Do ensure that the researcher makes a welcome call to each patient partner to explain the project and increase confidence and understanding. So this list is really great, and you can find this resource and the remaining 7 do's and don'ts on the DAC website. So how are we investigating the lived experiences of diabetes? In the next section of this webinar, I'll be explaining our research project and how we're incorporating an intersectional SGBA Plus lens throughout, starting with the research questions. So the focus of the study is informed by more than 2 years of planning and discussion with the Sex and Gender Research Enabling Group in partnership with DAC and in conversation with patient partners. It's also informed by a semi-systematic literature review that we just completed on diabetes research. So for that literature review, we looked at 200 results from a Google search, and only 46 of them, or about a quarter, included any data reported by sex and gender. We know that sex and gender are very important demographic factors and influence how people experience health-related things and healthcare. So sex and gender as a core lens for looking at diabetes is, we feel, very important. So our research questions, which are the questions that guide our research, are: what does it mean to live with diabetes from the patient's perspective? How do sex and gender interact with other socio-demographic factors, such as race, ethnicity, indigeneity, income, ability, and age, to shape these experiences? And how has COVID-19 affected the experiences of people with diabetes? This last question we've added because we're doing this research during a pandemic. And since we are doing this during a pandemic, we wanted to open the door for people to discuss if and how the pandemic is affecting their lives. We've heard informally from people so far, from some of the patient partners, that the COVID-19 pandemic is affecting people's access to medical care, their regular tools they use for self-management, and other things like that. And so we want to have an opportunity here to, depending on the timing and how long this pandemic lasts, potentially support people with diabetes who during the COVID-19 crisis, and also just shine a light on how that has affected them. So the next part, conceptualization of research. The concepts that drive our product are on this slide. So first and foremost, the project is centered on the philosophy that research is patient-informed and patient-centered. It should ultimately benefit people with diabetes. That is the main purpose of the research. Consulting with collective patient partner circle is important to developing patient-informed research design. We consulted with them in November and got some really valuable feedback that is on one of the next slides. We also believe that research should include a diverse range of participant demographics to allow for analyzing different parts of SGBA+. Qualitative methods are ideal for storytelling and in-depth explanations of experiences. And semi-structured interviews leave room if participants feel the conversation should go in a different direction. A semi-structured interview means that we have interview questions that we're going in with to an interview, but if a conversation goes in a different direction, we are able to follow that. It's not a strict interview schedule. So our data collection and recruitment. So interviews will be primarily on Zoom, and they'll start with a demographic survey and also have interview questions. We're recruiting 15 people for a 1 to 1.5 hour remote interview. All of our participants will have either type 1 or type 2 diabetes, be DAC patient partners. We're looking for a diverse group of participants, and interviews can be in English or French. The compensation will be $35 for their time, and recruitment is luckily going successfully so far and closing soon, probably this week. So also once we have our volunteer group, we'll be using maximum variation sampling to select participants amongst that group to try to have, as you would expect, a maximum variation in their demographics. So we're very happy that in our first 20 people who volunteered, we have a range of ages from 21 to 73. There's a good mix of type 1 and type 2 people with diabetes, people that speak English and people who speak French. We have 8 different ethnic and racial groups represented in this group, and otherwise we're looking forward to having a diversity of demographics and identities in this group. So some of our research questions, some of our interview questions are on the slide. We'll start with asking, can you tell me about your experience with diabetes? A question like this could take 2 minutes to answer, or 10 or 15. So we're starting out with this very broad question in case they just want to tell us a story. We're asking, how do you feel that your age, ethnicity, or gender impact your experience of living with and managing diabetes? Part of understanding our participants as experts in their own lives is giving room for them to theorize and share their theories with us if needed about how they think that those demographics affect their experience. We're asking, do people treat you differently because you have diabetes? If yes, how? What skills do you think that you've learned or developed to help manage your diabetes? And what kind of supports and resources have been most helpful to you in managing your diabetes? So at the next stage, the evaluation of results, we'll be looking at transcripts from people with type 1 and type 2 diabetes separately to begin with, and we'll report differences and commonalities between and amongst those different sets. This is really good feedback we got from the collective patient partner circle, that type 1 and type 2 diabetes, for a lot of people, our experience is radically different experiences, and so it's important not to lump those together. We'll be analyzing how patients' accounts differ by sex and gender, and other demographic characteristics and identities. And how we will go about analyzing this data is the first stage, or what we call preliminary coding. The transcripts of the interviews will be looked at by myself, Jennifer, and Robin, and we'll be anonymizing the data. So that means going through the transcripts, removing identifying information. If someone mentions their workplace, their partner's name, their children's name, other things like that, the street they live on, that kind of stuff will be removed. And we'll also be doing what we call bucket coding. So we'll break up people's stories or people's answers to the interview questions into topics. And something can be in multiple topics or buckets at once. So if, for example, someone talks about family, that might go into the family bucket, which is, I say bucket, but it's really a document. It'll go in the family one. If they talk about self-image, that will go in the self-image one. And at the end of that process, we have different documents with different topics where there's different parts of stories from multiple participants. The next part is called thematic analysis. And at that point, our DAC patient partners will join us. This means that they will be able to lend their expertise and their vision to what they see as patterns arising in the data. But because they're broken up like that, it will help protect the anonymity of the participants in case they're in similar patient partner circles. So at that part, the thematic analysis will be looking at how sex, gender, and other demographic characteristics impact people's experiences, but also what other thematic patterns we're seeing across the data. So the main purpose of this research is to benefit people with diabetes. We intend to do this by adding to the existing diabetes literature, modeling how to use an SGBA plus lens in diabetes research, and influencing other researchers to adopt more inclusive and patient-oriented research design. We're also looking to use the materials and training at Women's College Hospital and outside of it, so people who provide care to people with diabetes are better informed about the diversity of experience that people may have. So for example, there is a study of Bangladeshi people in the United Kingdom that we found very interesting because they found that Bangladeshi women in the United Kingdom reported that their advice from their doctor about exercise was not culturally appropriate. So they were being told to go to exercise classes, go running outside, but they told the interviewers that this was not culturally appropriate advice because they could not engage in vigorous exercise with other people, and especially in a mixed gender environment, and that they could not engage in vigorous exercise outdoors. And so instead of getting actually advice that they could use, they had to kind of either figure it out themselves or just not engage in exercise at all. So that's an example of how if the healthcare providers consider and ask questions about a person's demographics and identities and how that impacts their experience, they're better able to give them advice and medical care that works for them. So the last thing we're looking for here is informing tailored strategies to people's needs with medical care. We'll always be open, though, to other ways that we can benefit people with diabetes through this research. So if you have any ideas, you're welcome to tell us, and we'll still be consulting with our patient partners and the collective patient partner circle. So last, if you're interested in exploring more resources about why sex and gender matter in health research, there's something called the Health Researchers Toolkit on the Women's College Research Institute's website. There are 8 e-learning modules from activism and evidence to why do sex and gender matter and others that are on the screen. There's also, there's currently only a bilingual mode, which was published in November, which is about intersectionality. That's the one in green at the bottom. So thank you so much for coming to our webinar. We're happy to take any questions or comments at this time.
Well, thank you, Jennifer and Zoe. I can definitely tell you that I learned a lot in today's webinar, especially in the introduction. I know that sex and gender is sometimes a difficult concept to apply in research, and people do struggle in that area. So while we wait for questions to come in from the audience, I do have a question of my own. Given that sex and gender is hard to apply, how do you find the uptake of researchers when you add in the extra layer of complexity with intersectionality? And I know this is becoming a new requirement for a lot of research proposals for funding. So I'm curious to hear your perspectives.
Jennifer, do you want to answer that? Because you did that intersectionality module.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Tracy. So that's a great question. Honestly, I think it's something that a lot of researchers in the intersectionality field are struggling with, mostly because it largely depends on the availability of data. And so at Women's College Hospital, another group that I'm working with, also led by Dr. Paula Rochon, is looking at medication safety among older adults. And it's actually an international study. So we've been trying to gather data from, I think it's Ireland, Italy, Israel, and Canada. And we've been looking for data that's disaggregated by sex and age. So you can look specifically at the differences between and within groups of older women and men. But we're finding that this data is very hard to find, or if it exists at all. And so, and really like the data is the first step to being able to see these differences. And without that, it's hard to really see how you can move forward and ask those more, in-depth questions about why we're seeing these differences. And then otherwise, like these groups are just invisible if you're not collecting the data on them. So yeah, I would say first and foremost, we need better data and better standardized methods for collecting data on sociodemographic factors.
Oh, sorry, Zoe, go on.
Yeah, I can just add to that also, so when we did the literature review, we found that there was a lot of, sometimes we need researchers to use the right words or learn about intersectionality to learn what to identify, because frequently researchers in diabetes and outside of it just won't mention what race or ethnicity their participants are. They might not even mention what gender they are. Age usually gets mentioned as a range, but if they're age 18 to 80 and they don't disaggregate within that, it ends up being this big lump that you're not able to actually pull out any of the information that could be useful in an intersectional way. So informing researchers about how to identify what they're doing and what information about their participants they should be recording and sharing is really important.
Well, thank you. And actually, while you were talking, another question popped into my mind, and while there's none here, I can ask it. So we know that diabetes disproportionately affects or impacts vulnerable populations, and a lot of those vulnerable populations were discussed today when we were talking about sex and gender and intersectionality. One of the challenges we have as a network is actually reaching some of these vulnerable populations and engaging them in research. Is this something that you are looking at for your study, and as it evolves beyond Diabetes Action Canada to areas and groups that are more impacted by diabetes because of their socioeconomic status?
Jen, do you want to say something or do you want me to?
Yeah, you can go ahead, Zoe.
Okay, so for one, so we haven't looked at yet what the next steps are past this project, but I'm really excited for about half of what it looks like is half of our participants are going to be people of color, which is not common in diabetes research. Usually they're all of one group, like it was targeted for, there's a study of Black men in the US and they targeted that population, but the default tends to be white cisgender people in Canada. And so we're excited about that, and any hints that we see might support following that in following past that. But what you're talking about is really important, because when you look at intersectionality, actually gives us a lens to understand who volunteers for research and why. And so thinking about who has the free time and who has the emotional bandwidth, who only has one job or might not have a job, or other things like that. So that definitely impacts who volunteers. We definitely see that, for example, like white people are overrepresented in research because like there's systemic analyses you can make about why that is. But I think that you're right that targeted recruitment is really important to reaching more vulnerable populations and having them represented in research and in activism.
Well, thank you very much, Jennifer and Zoe. If questions do arise from the audience or by those who decide to watch the recording of this webinar thereafter, these can easily be directed to myself or Jennifer or Zoe. All of our contact information will be on the YouTube link for today's webinar. So thank you all for coming today and participating in our Research Spotlight for February. We are very excited to have had the Sex and Gender group explain this very important but sometimes quite complex concept that has, I think, boggled many people's minds in our network. And this has definitely given us a lot to think about as we start thinking about our research going forward. So thank you for today, and have a great day, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.